Bardo, Dana, Chasa, Dagger, Dollar Panzer, Voice, and Tanchi, Devato, Jedo, Demara, Durhato, Durati, Jedo, Trawat, Durha, maybe Deva, Tomato, Mandawat, Yari Chato, Nito, Trave, Tonyon, Never, Jara, Metal, Rara, the Mando, Sonja, Gina, Power. Nakana Naja Joy, Sanche Lanja Samba, Moy Shara, Jatawa, Teju, Tomonta, Chicho Kolo, Gordo, Soy, Lamato, Kanjo, Moje, Namasanji, Dodo, Sanche, Doce, Lo Chiso, Roa, Sanje, Ladu. Chila dentro watching ladu so launch watching ladu Chino just watching ladu so lamato kajur mocha numbers Dado Sanchin Tachi or Chisel watching ladu Chila dentro watching ladu so launch watching ladu Chino just watching Lado so Lamato Kachur Moja Namasan Dado Sanchin Tachi or Chisel watching ladu Chilando watching ladu so launch watching ladu Chino just Shajilado so Wana Nakato Yame Sanchin Tachi Lana me payo taba zope sunje che komputa prasha de che da me che samo sente tunyas je para joa nyame te che samo sa tate semare jo tene tare ka kaso tene Los Angeles tene ngaro sa thor moda bode jagana yone kabato tembe chebo pama mo zam Papa Della Yupe Lama Trava Ane Dasa Toma Tombo Chila Ozuchi Radishum Terim Dokula Losu Dasu Dene Pase Pay Peke Yapo Cheke Chichen as Yapo Tenen Cheke Kunkendabo Tele Chi Yapo Dut Kendabo Yes Sela Peto Kendabo Tezare That's all. You better touch it and down, Chichi Hojo Chaji, but the Charaga covers the motto, Gatachable shoes.
Rinpoche says, in general, I would like to express how happy I am to be able to come on this occasion to Los Angeles, particularly since I had to come from such a long distance from India. The fact that I've been able to come and arrive safely and meet with all of you gives me a great deal of joy. To meet with all of you in the audience, you men and women who, through your interest and sincerity in following the spiritual path, are experiencing the great good fortune of these teachings. In particular, I would like to welcome the lamas and the monks and nuns who are present as the members of the ordained Sangha among us, many of whom have undertaken the monastic ordination as a sign of their sincere commitment to the teachings. They have taken part, many of them, in the traditional 3-month retreat program, which is a training ground both for one's own practice and for the the capabilities to benefit others through teaching. These individuals have also trained in the Tibetan language in order to be able to access the teachings of Dharma in the original scriptures and thus improve their understanding. This is something that benefits not only the individual who studies and practices in this way, but it also renders them more able to benefit others. And the fact that so many of us can come together in these very auspicious circumstances gives me a feeling of great joy, and I wish to express that to you this evening.
Sentensi pata tene gara sena tene lato nato pa drakhen 저도 나서 봐 이렇게 산에 받더라 그는 산천사가요레스 산천에 콜아요 근데 야와여도 돈로서가 손좀 하도 먼저 하와에서 토리가 났을때 너와리 두고 났을 때 야레스 되노네 되는 알았어 토리가 때 도보다버때 매일 단서를 되는 때 저러고 야포레스 야포노네 되는 토리가 때 있나요 될 시작하는 사람도 초도 가족도 레바에 믿고 오기 치라 강했다 그래도 지금 나서 가면 시봐도 이라 지금 써만을 받더라 뭐 뭐야 말았어 뒤노네들 저러서 투만 지라 대가 로지지 시작하면 라서 뭐 세대 되는 치라 허준도 오 치라서 버셔와대 되는 사람을 리테서 뭐 단저 저저도 되는 뭐 치라 써와다 뭐 때나 이제 커서 알아서 설동 되는 못이동 도저 파나 그래서를 못 지었어요. 그래서 전부 대답하니까 매일 못 지어서 저러서 타바다 저러 가봐서 말했어.
There is the state of an awakened, enlightened being, which we might term Buddhahood, and that of an unenlightened, unawakened being, a sentient being, an ordinary sentient being. And if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, we realize, most of us, that we fall into the second category. That if we're going to be classified anywhere in these two categories, it's going to be as a sentient being. And what that implies is that our minds are currently under the influence of and experience things in terms of a dualistic and discursive mode of consciousness. There's a continual subject-object differentiation in the way we perceive the world around us, which causes our minds to entertain discursive thought patterns. And this is what we would term a sentient being. According to the Buddhist teachings, there are 6 different possibilities of rebirth within this cycle of samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence that is experienced by sentient beings. 3 of these are lower states of rebirth, in the hells, in the realm of the pretas or hungry ghosts, and in the animal realm. And 3 of these are, relatively speaking, superior or higher realms of rebirth, in that they are more fortunate states. The human realm, the realm of demigods, and the realm of gods, the gods of the cycle of rebirth. These constitute the 6 categories, the 6 realms of being. We, of course, have attained in this human rebirth a relatively fortunate state of rebirth. It is fortunate because it provides a useful working basis for spiritual development. The fact that we have come by this human state of rebirth is not something that happens haphazardly or at random. It is due to merit and virtue reinforced in previous existences, combined with our own aspirations and a connection that we have established in the past with the 3 jewels, with the sources of refuge. And this is what accounts for us attaining this favorable state of rebirth in this life. It also accounts for the fact that we feel naturally inclined. We feel a natural faith. We feel a natural inclination or interest in the teachings of Buddhism. The fact that some of us automatically feel this kind of faith and joy in a spiritual tradition is an indication of these previous karmic connections. And to use this human existence well, to receive further teachings, to receive empowerments, and to put these transmissions into practice, all of this means that what might have been an ordinary human rebirth has become a precious human existence. And the term precious here is used in the way it is used to describe, for example, something like gold or pearls or diamonds in this world, things that we value, that we consider rare, precious, difficult to come by, and very, very useful when they are acquired. In the same way, the precious human existence is that very fortunate state where the potential of the human being is realized through spiritual practice.
pena matrago kolotaba kone siala batela koasa gares tene koatela dunha momboyares te kayares ne yala zoche ki tsarogo to ga yedola te kong to ga 들어라 뭐 거시라 수바 지라지 사회도가 요아레스 들어말라 나로스 말라 셔도가 개피도가 나이도가 쳐도가 등하지 뭐지요아레스 사마이나 저도도 제도 그 타제가 동아요아레스 살아 들어 등하 문제 때나 참 봐도 같이 뭐요아레스 대자자 거도 같이 자쳤다버레스 텔레 동하 텔레 타와세 페네트니 타바 손제적 컴포스 저거요아레스
This then is the situation of a sentient being, an unenlightened being, that there is a continual wandering of the mind in rebirth after rebirth in the cycle we know technically as samsara. And this process is fueled by the actions that are committed by an individual being. When these actions are of a positive nature, then the karma which is generated by these actions contributes through a process of causality to the attainment and the experience of higher states of rebirth, relatively speaking, with greater degrees of freedom, greater degrees of happiness and satisfaction. When the actions of that being are of a largely negative and harmful nature, then this negative karmic patterning contributes through a process of causality to rebirth in the three relatively lower realms. But the mind is never completely free from any of these alternatives. It is always wandering from one to another of these in a vicious circle. And because there is this cyclic nature, because it moves around just like the wheel of a car, moving around and around and around again with no escape, no break, no interruption, it is termed in Sanskrit samsara, in Tibetan korwa, which simply means the turning, or the wheel, the cycle. And this whole process involves a great deal of suffering, though that suffering differs from one realm to the other. In the realms of the hell beings, the suffering is largely due to the intense heat and cold to which these beings are subjected in their environment. In the realm of the pretas, or hungry ghosts, the suffering is largely due to hunger and thirst and exposure to the elements. In the realm of animals, the affliction is due in part to the struggle for survival, the chain of life where there is one species continually predating on another species, and also due to the activities of human beings in domesticating these animals and bending them to their service and to their will and misusing them and ill-treating them. Among human beings, as we are quite aware, there are many sufferings, perhaps the major ones being those of birth, the pain of the birth process, the pain of the aging process, the pain of sickness and disease, and finally the pain of death. Among demigods, the suffering is largely due to the jealousy and envy in their minds, which gives rise to the quarrel and strife among these beings. And although such overt forms of suffering may not be present in the experience of devas or the gods of samsara, there is an all-pervasive suffering which eventually results in their falling into a much lower state of rebirth and experiencing the agonies of this. And when we examine the alternatives within the cycle of rebirth in this way, we see that it truly is, as the teachings tell us, an ocean of suffering, a vast ocean from which there is an automatic, a very natural inclination for the individual to want to be freed, to want to transcend. And this is a state, this state of transcendence, this state of release from this ocean of suffering is what we might term Buddhahood, awakened enlightenment. In pursuing this goal of release, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, there are a number of different approaches which can be employed. There is the so-called Hinayana approach of the Shravakas, of those who hear and practice the teachings on this level, those who attain the realization of an Arhat or a Pratyeka Buddha, a so-called self-made Buddha. There are those who may follow the Mahayana path of the Bodhisattva and traverse the 10 bhumis, the 10 levels of Bodhisattva realization, from the first to the 10th, and thus progress to full enlightenment. There are many different approaches, in short, all of which lead eventually toward the same goal. They may all be considered true paths towards liberation, towards awakened enlightenment, because they all ultimately aim toward the same goal, which is to say they aim towards the release of the individual from the cycle of rebirth. And so the different approaches towards the awakened state of enlightenment, which constitutes this release or liberation, are sometimes classified as the 3 yanas, sometimes classified as the 9 yanas, and there are any number of schemata for delineating these vehicles, up to and including an infinity of approaches. But it is useful enough for our purposes to consider these approaches to fall into 2 categories, the lesser and the greater vehicle. Speaking very, very broadly and simply, we can classify the approaches of the Buddhist path into those of the Hinayana and those of the Mahayana. And within the Mahayana, the greater vehicle of Mahayana, we can distinguish that there is a dialectic approach, a causal vehicle, which employs methods as causes leading to eventual results, which is known as the vehicle of the paramitas, of the perfections. And then there is the secret mantra path of the Vajrayana, in which the goal is an ever-present possibility, a much more rapid path. The particular empowerment that we are concerned with this evening and over the next 2 days is an empowerment into the mandala of the peaceful and wrathful deities of the Bardo, or after-death state. And it is part of the cycle of the so-called Bardo Tudral, or as it is commonly referred to in English, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Constituting as it does a major empowerment into the mandalas of these deities, this empowerment partakes of the approach which is the pinnacle, which is the very pinnacle of all of these, that is to say, the secret mantra path of Vajrayana. In this particular fortunate kalpa, or age, in which we live, there have appeared and will appear a total of 1,000 Buddhas, fully enlightened beings. The Buddha Shakyamuni, who appeared in the country of India some 2,500 years ago, was the 4th of these guides that will eventually appear during this age. And by demonstrating the 12 great deeds of a fully enlightened Buddha and appearing and teaching in the country of India so many years ago, the Buddha Shakyamuni established a legacy of teachings that was truly vast and profound in its implications. He taught from both the approach of both the Sutra tradition, the exoteric tradition of Buddhism, and the more esoteric tantric approach of Vajrayana. He taught the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana in such a complete way, and these teachings spread so widely that the number of people who became, over the generations, learned and accomplished and realized in these teachings was truly as numerous, these beings were truly as numerous as the stars in the nighttime sky. And from this Indian tradition of Buddhism, there occurred a historical transmission of the teachings to the land of snows, the country to the north of India, which we know as Tibet. Now, originally, Tibet was an extremely backward and uncivilized place. It was regarded by most of the civilized world as a land of demons. And the status, the level to which the Tibetan people had progressed was very, very rudimentary. There was not even a coherent system of government or of organization of the Tibetan peoples, but rather they lived in anarchistic tribal units scattered across the valleys of Central Asia. It was only when emanations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas appeared among them as rulers and leaders over generations, beginning to organize and bring together the Tibetan people as a nation. It was only at that point that, due to the further activity of such emanations of great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, that the teachings of Buddhism were able to be transplanted from their Indian home to this country of Tibet. And so gradually over the centuries there was this process of assimilation where the Buddhist teachings gradually began to move across the Himalayas to the land of snows.
자가네 서도 치만바죠 하바도 시라즈가 다치 년시장아 나소파 별을 줄때 시라즈가 거네 너데 나카도냐 맞제 대마스 자네 자자 꼰조 바 네팔 바이네 바자 투츠 카시제 대는지 관람 되네 사사가 저 이기나 봐 찾자면도 저 멋에다지 이 대조대 되네 담에 치죠네 소아레스.
In particular, it was during the reign of the Tibetan king known as Songtsen Gampo, who is regarded historically as having been the actual presence of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, appearing among the Tibetan people. It was during the reign of this king that the final consolidation of the Tibetan Empire took place, and all of the tribes and peoples of the area we now know as Tibet were brought together under a single rule, as a single nation. It was also during the reign of this king, Songtsen Gampo, that the first formal introduction of Buddhism into Tibet took place. In particular, this king was responsible for the bringing to Tibet from India of many different scriptures associated with Buddhism, particularly with the practice and teachings surrounding the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, and the translation of these texts into the Tibetan language. And due to this activity, the king began the process of introducing and assimilating the Buddhist teachings into his home culture. As well, he married a princess of the Chinese court and a princess of the Nepalese court, and when these two queens were brought from their homelands to Tibet, they brought with them tangible signs of their own culture's faith in the Buddhist teachings. In particular, they brought to Tibet two of the holiest statues of the Buddha, one of which is known as Joel Rinpoche, or the Precious Lord, and the other of which is known as Joel Michidorje, the Lord who is the unshakable Vajra. And these two statues were brought to Tibet and installed in cathedrals in Lhasa. And this is considered historically by the Tibetan people to be the date of the formal introduction of the Buddhist teachings to their culture, that taking place during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo.
Tene chiti jaba shonsi sume chuba yinza jagane kemo bodo sato to lobe pe manjune ten rabaga kedu mambo shen chone pelo tene sonje chi tema tawanze tene lobe pe manjune no kuna me loma Germania sitanga yebetoso jasula supasete soha shoda nahani hapata soha temate nimatsa jinda pel jene jwata pata kepetsu Nauki kamata bishwares Della chita sonjega tema hemata wado tsogyares Tessa hemata ni vasyares Tessa soha ima pasene pel chijito moda bishwares hemata.
In succeeding generations, the Tibetan kings continued this work of assimilation, and in particular, 2 or 3 generations following Songtsen Gampo, his descendant, a king whose name was Trisung Detsen, and who again is regarded historically as an emanation of a great bodhisattva. King Trisung Detsen was responsible for inviting to Tibet from India great figures of the Indian Buddhist tradition, in particular an abbot whose name was Shanti Rakshita, and a great tantric master whose name was Padmasambhava. And along with many other teachers who were invited to Tibet under the auspices of King Trisung Detsen's government, the teachings of Buddhism flourished even more widely. In particular, Padmasambhava was responsible for teaching directly to Trisung Detsen, King Trisung Detsen, and his ministers and subjects, presenting the teachings of the Vajrayana. There were a group of 25 members of the court who were personal students of Padmasambhava, as well as many other members of the Tibetan populace who studied this path. And so in general, during the reign of Trisung Detsen in the 8th century, the teachings of the Sutra tradition and Tantra tradition spread even more widely in Tibet. In particular, it was the teachings of Vajrayana that captured the imagination of the Tibetan people, such that the tradition of Vajrayana, of Tantric Buddhism, began to shine like the sun throughout the Tibetan region, and the number of people who gained realization and understanding through these teachings were again as numerous as the stars in the sky. Those of you who are familiar with the term Nyingma as one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism might be interested to know that this term literally means the ancient or the old school, and it dates from these early origins of Buddhism in Tibet, because this is the earliest historical school that can be determined in Tibet itself. It is known as the Nyingma, or ancient school.
Kanga mambo kone lots of mambo tone George Pade Atisha la super Kevato Travato Prisebo Mambo Pel Dentro Penayum you Shojitsa Mericaka Shara Chimbo Zende Chimbotene Mambo Jagala Tone Gaja Tame lots of Tutroto lots of Jajito lots of Chimbotosa Pella Walata no machine, then Pella Chi, Yonsu to Pata Harinenzo to Pata Jitchamusharis, Teta Jitchuashate, Sicila, Gaji, Sacha, Kelly, Jono, Chumba, Lasupa, Dichita Day, Tamashari, Hemason, Yuaga, Dichita Jessica, Pel Tasori, that Hemata Soha Imachi, Tijela Tawate. And
flourish among the Tibetan people over following centuries. There is an old proverb to the effect that for that which is precious and valuable, there are always many obstacles. There are always many damage or impair this thing. And such was the case historically in Tibet. There were many setbacks, there were many persecutions and attempts to overthrow the Buddhist teachings among the Tibetan people. But ultimately, these proved fruitless. At a certain point in history, during the 11th century, a Tibetan king in the south of Tibet, whose name was Hla Lama Changchub-e, which his name literally means the light of enlightenment, became concerned at what he saw not only as obstacles to the teachings in the Tibetan cultural situation, but also as what he perceived as signs of degeneration and corruption in the teachings themselves. And he felt it was very important to revivify these teachings by inviting again great masters from India to come and teach. And it was under his auspices that many great scholars and teachers of Indian Buddhism, in particular the great Atisha of India, were invited to Tibet. As well, it was at this time that many Tibetans who proved themselves very wise, of great intelligence and great diligence in industry, were sent to India in order to learn the indigenous languages there so that they could become translators and translate the teachings accurately from Sanskrit and other Indian languages into their own native Tibetan language. And due to the activity of these many hundreds of translators who were trained, the teachings again began to spread widely in a revivified and purified form. And from that time in the 11th century that this new school of translation was instituted, some 7 distinct lineages grew up. And these are known to us today as the Kargyupa school, the Sakyapa school, the Gelugpa school, the Jonangpa school, the Shangpa school, and so forth. There are, in fact, 7 of these in total. And these, taken together with the earlier or ancient tradition of the Nyingma, are sometimes referred to as the 8 great practice lineages of Tibet. And in addition, another distinction which is sometimes made historically is between the Nyingma school as the sole surviving legacy from the early spread of Buddhism in the 8th century, taking that as the Nyingma, as the ancient tradition, and taking all of the other 7 that developed from the 11th century onwards as the so-called Sarma, or new schools. And so you will very often see reference in Tibetan texts to Sar Nying, that is to say, new and old, the new lineages, the more recent lineages, and the older or more ancient lineage. Now, it might seem, if we look at the surface of things, that these are distinct or separate lineages that are very different from one another. These so-called 8 lineages, for example, in the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism. But if we examine things on a more inner or profound level, we realize that all of these are the same in that they present, each and every one of them, a specific and complete path for a given individual to attain awakened enlightenment, to attain the level of Buddhahood. In that respect, all of these schools are identical, though they may differ in their specific methods and their specific means of presentation. The transmission with which we are concerned this weekend, which is part and parcel of the so-called Bardo Tudral, or Tibetan Book of the Dead cycle, these are an example of these kinds of teachings which exist in each and every one of these lineages that can provide the opportunity for a given individual to attain Buddhahood. The teachings of Buddhism, when taken together, are extremely vast and extremely profound and present a wealth of techniques, a wealth of different approaches. Some of these are more suited, more adapted to those who lead very busy and complex lives and have very little time or energy to devote to formal religious practice. And this is the reason why you will often find these practices referred to in the Tibetan tradition as Tongdrol, which simply means liberation through seeing, or Tudrol, liberation through hearing. That mere contact with these teachings carries with it a powerful blessing that can be a very effective impetus to the spiritual development of the individual.
Bardo nasi jekkayaris, yena bardo nasi la bardo tene chebo ijato trudu nga, tene yung bardo chong na barabo tene zitagayaris nasi mambayaris, taso tene jepa tise ndonga barite, yena do di barabo chena bardo sakate, pena rajni yana rajni ka bardo la bardo sagayaris. Terabuji hemata jemaniga chandrabola badasagayares. Tere pena marosina tomba amana shena shamada chapate sashi badasagayares. Ni kuna ni ku chawato ni masa chapado mana badasagayares. 되네 알아서 처에네 저태네 되네 저차 마소지 받아 시시 받아서 요레스 되네 전에 재미도 자르고 요레스 재미도 자와때 정말 많이 받으러 진이 받아서 요레스 되네 요 처변 통한 차거레스 처변 통한 하서봐 다 따라가서 세는 나도 고에 받는 거지 탐에 받잖네 되네 예리도 가서 되나 시험지만 람베 카텔라 되네 스파 받아서 요레스 되네 스파 받네 앞에는 알아서 따라이나 많이 가듯이라서나 제 마셔져 받으러 되네 시내 받아서 요레스 되네 시차는 마셔져 받아 거의 좀 코로가 요리다 받아 지하라고 나서 들리지레스
One of the fundamental concepts contained within this cycle of teachings is that which is known in Tibetan as Bardo, or what we might translate as an intermediate state, an interval. And this concept of Bardo is discussed from any number of different points of view. You sometimes find reference in the teachings to the 4 great Bardos or interval states, or the 5 great Bardos, or the 6 great Bardos, or even an infinite number of interval states. There are many different ways of looking at this particular aspect of our experience. And a great deal of time, which we don't happen to have, could be spent discussing this concept in excruciating detail. But we can look at it from a very rough overview. Let's take this term Bardo in Tibetan. Par meaning interval and do meaning two, between two. The idea of an interval or space between two things or two events. In terms of physical space, we could look at the space between two mountaintops and say that that was a Bardo, that was an interval or an intermediate space. But the kind of Bardo that we are talking about here is more one of psychology and experience. For example, the interval between our previous lifetime and our future lifetime, that is to say, this lifetime, can be regarded from this point of view as a Bardo state, as an intermediate or interval state. Now, from the time that we are conceived in our mother's womb to the time that we eventually die in this lifetime, this constitutes one major Bardo, or one major interval in our experience, the Bardo of birth and death, from the moment of conception to the moment that we die. We experience a different kind of Bardo when we go to sleep at night and experience the dream state, the Bardo of the dream state, which lasts as long as we are asleep, from the time we go to sleep to the time that we wake up in the morning. So within the greater context of the Bardo between life and death, between birth and death, there is a second kind of Bardo, a second kind of interval or intermediate state, which is associated with dream. At the point in this lifetime that we actually come to die, the process of dying, as our mind-body complex gradually disintegrates, is a third kind of Bardo, which is known as the Bardo of the time of death. Following our death, there is, by and large, for the vast majority of beings, a period of unconsciousness. And following this period of unconsciousness, the first glimmerings of a returning consciousness in a disembodied state after death. And this particular interval of unconsciousness and the slow stirrings of returning consciousness is known as the Bardo of Dharmata, the Bardo of the fundamental nature of reality. And following this, there is a period of time which is indefinite in length, during which the mind experiences all kinds of confused hallucinations and projections, which go on endlessly, until such time as the individual karma of that being, of that consciousness, propels it into a future state of rebirth. For example, in the case of a being reborn as a human, it would be up until the point that the mind is implanted in the mother's womb during the process of conception. And that interval during which the mind experiences these chaotic and often very terrifying and frightening hallucinations, this is known as the Bardo of becoming. And it lasts up until the time that the being actually takes rebirth in a physical form again. And so we can see that these different states of Bardo, or interval state, are simply another way of describing the cycle of rebirth, because there is a continuity, moving from one state of Bardo to the other, always experiencing one or the other of these kinds of Bardo, these kinds of intervals or intermediate states.
Then she pardon della che chesiris. Karasana, Tanja to the Malaysian Butcher, Tatsala Yinza, then Yantori to Tabalan, Chitanayo, Tata Castle, Chubert Togayaris, such a legion so jetaba, Jetsamanata, Comfort Totapachena, Tata, Maraso Soso Lapaliaris, me, Nason Talapala, the Shiati Jela, Nason Talapala, to be led to Sona, Tata saw Togayaris. That's just a getting so typical little Chumbajinza, Shashi Pattern de Latine, the Papu Gerdu, Chion Tapatinas, Lantapate, Sharona Chimboke, Chimbodoburis, then Shashi Patu Secretary, Pena Samar and Bodoburis, Samar, Rinpoche, then Chepakal, Letteris, Combatant Toads and Goggles, in a Kotayum. Then Chipaka letters, Tata Garos of Tomo, then Siane, Pogachuris, then Rembe Yapoga Cherdon, Talpa, then Lojolas of Pazoviares, then Tata Tesor Yandone, then Talpapa de Hanum, game again you can sound double, that's how it is. That is, Samati Shakadable, Tisana, Sunni double sound, that's yet Samati Pakal, Lenjimana, Toshiris. That's yet that Sasi Padar Sane, then Chakapadal Mallet, Tamere, or the Padar Kechi, the Tataris.
We are, of course, according to this schema, we are currently experiencing in our waking state at this moment the Bardo between birth and death. And from the point of view of these teachings, this is the most significant Bardo state that we ever experience, precisely because it carries with it a great deal of power. The actions that one commits as a conscious being, particularly as a human being with that favorable working basis for spiritual development, the acts that one commits within that bardo or that interval state carry the most weight. We are, in a sense, on a pivotal point. If we choose to progress upwards to higher states of rebirth, or ideally to practice purely the teachings of Dharma, the actions that we direct towards those goals in this waking state between birth and death carry the most weight, far more than any that we might undertake in other pardo or intermediate states. We have the potential as human beings to attain the full awakened enlightenment of Buddhahood in this very life, in this very body, as did someone such as the Venerable Milarepa. That is in the palm of our hands right now. But if we choose to waste or misuse that opportunity and to ensure that our mind will plunge into very negative and low states of rebirth, we also have the potential to do that, because what we commit in this lifetime carries with it great karmic weight, great consequences. It is because of the power, because of the force or strength of our actions in this life on a karmic level, that this bardo, this interval, is the most crucial, is the most powerful state, and is the most important one to which to direct our attentions. We are, as it were, on a bridge. We might think of this lifetime between birth and death as a bridge that we are traveling. It may be a very long bridge, but then again we may travel by car and arrive very quickly at the end of the bridge. Or we may walk and arrive very slowly at the end of that bridge. But sooner or later all of us are going to arrive at the end of that bridge. We have no choice but to keep walking along that bridge. When we were born as very, very small infants, we began to grow, we began to age immediately. We began to move towards the end of that bridge, slowly but surely. We grew up to adolescence and became young adults, young men and women. We went to school, we learned trades or professions, we began to establish our lives. And we, most of us perhaps, find that we're now at middle age. We're kind of on the borderline where we wouldn't quite say we were old, but we wouldn't quite say we were young. We're getting on that bridge further and further. Some of us might feel we're halfway there, some of us might feel we're 2/3 of the way there. But all of us know we're going to arrive at the end of that bridge sooner or later. It is guaranteed. No matter how long it takes or how short a time it takes, the one guarantee we have is that we are walking on that bridge and we are going to arrive at the end of that bridge, which is to say, we are going to have to face the bardo of dying. That is something we are all very sure of, if we think about it.
Then, that second part of the then, share, Matsuma, then, Jitan, the Topare, the Mare, Chiraga, Ketchamore, Shipare, Sane, then, Titanda, Jandu, Yasoto, Ivan Hatsupe, Massa, Ketchu, Zodoris, Massa, Zosana, Jitan, the Nasa Soma, Malazom, but in the sense wonderful. Touch it, teaching a journey, Ronka said, keep it the getting just a drone, drug yard, take all the only parties and chance that wrong catch it, Amari, like getting on drug yard. That's it, that's no, you remember it on a Sarah catch a book teachers. That's it, that my shits and chills chick yard, rather sooner, Ronka seller, Ronta, but that Mazuna. Dage lema is kya tade so dipandre se poso asya jema de meso mandane thori to tabela de de thojere sa lo dewa da bu tansuna de rat chipada bu de data bu nas de jara ke chemo tanche thulu yaki bajres.
Now, in this interval between birth and death, those of us who attain rebirth in this human realm tend to treat the world around us as something permanent, as something solid and real, something ultimately there, something extremely important, and somehow something that determines ultimately our happiness and well-being. And so we devote so much of our time and our effort and our attention in this life to defending ourselves against enemies and consolidating ourselves with friends and establishing some kind of position in this world with all of this effort in the misguided hope that here is something solid, eternal, definite that we can rely upon. And at a certain point that is no longer the case. We come to the end of our lives, inevitably, and it's just like waking up from a dream. And even if it was a good dream, we woke up from the dream, and everything just has to be laid down at that point. Everything that we invested with all of that solidity and all of that importance no longer matters. And then we become a sentient being in the Bardo. Our mind, disembodied, wanders in the after-death state, where there is absolutely no control, absolutely no ability to determine or manipulate our environment. We are entirely subject in a very helpless and terrifying way to the projections of our karma. And so, if we think about it in a more long-term way, what becomes truly important is not simply what we can acquire and consolidate in this life on a mundane level, but what kind of spiritual development we can make in preparation not only for this life, but for the future. Ideally, we can aspire to attain full and complete control and realization of our own minds, and transcend this cycle of rebirth once and for all. But at the very least, we can live our lives in such a way that we accentuate in ourselves and others that which is virtuous and positive, that we eliminate and diminish the effect of that which is negative and harmful, and so that we can approach our death with a cheerful frame of mind, so that we can die with an easy mind, realizing that we have laid a good foundation for the future, and that our mind will not fall into a state of greater suffering and greater ignorance and confusion, but will attain to a higher state from which we can continue our spiritual development. This is something Rinpoche says that I want all of you to think about very deeply, please, because it is a very crucial issue.
Ngarasu Tumaka Partana, Jitendela, Dot Chimbo, On Chimbo, Jichamo, Lonsu Chimbo, Mamboyaris, Desotene, Jula Shuamata, Detka Sayamari, Mumambo, Chindoyaris, Chekala, then Toto, Masu Jelonsi, Korosoka, Katagudu, Tetaja Yana, Korochi Peshadogu, then Ngarasu Totayaris. Delatane, then others jealous young men are taught me by Dovajiri, those are Jun and Jigger, Childress, how to have church and keep it there, Madrid now, then Dosaji, Dasaji, Jalak and Bajiana, Pasha, so Terry, taking deep sorry, Lel Habodaris, then Tessa, so Chichi, that time the Hasijan, Roro. Yasun the Mandorn, 30 kilometers, Sonja Copo Totabaji, Sharaka, Chemores, the Sashi Pazo, Lanka, Cheshida, Teres.
And so, if we look at this objectively, while we see that in this world there are many people who attempt to gain power and wealth and fame, and great enjoyment, luxury, and so forth, we can also appreciate the fact that none of us escape death, that everyone eventually dies. And we can really, looking at it scientifically, so to speak, we can see, does any of this wealth, does any of this power, does any of this influence ultimately benefit the individual? When we see someone who is wealthy, who dies, did that wealth eventually, ultimately do them any good? Temporarily perhaps, but ultimately no. We can see for ourselves. This is not to say that a person does not have needs that must be met. But it's a case of proper perspective. What does a person really need? If they have enough to eat, enough to wear on their back, have a nice place to stay, what more could they want? And yet so many of us are continually involved in wanting more and more that we don't actually need. And it's a case of establishing a proper perspective on what is truly and ultimately meaningful and important. Surely it is a far greater goal to work towards higher states of rebirth and ultimately the release of the mind into the awakened state of Buddhahood. Surely that is a far greater goal than merely trying to consolidate more and more within the single context of this lifetime. In fact, involving ourselves in this spiritual process of development towards higher states of rebirth temporarily and ultimately the goal of Buddhahood, this is perhaps the greatest responsibility, the greatest task that we can undertake within this brief interval between birth and death. During this present Bardo or interval state between birth and death, we are not able to engage in a very deep far-reaching practice of virtue, spiritual practice. Nevertheless, it is possible through the connections that we establish in this lifetime with the Dharma, with the Three Jewels, particularly through the vehicle of tantric empowerment and the introduction to the blessings of these teachings, it is possible that through our faith and connection, that when we come to die, there can nevertheless be benefit, even though we may have not been able to carry these teachings through to their ideal consummation. We may die because of an illness, we may die in an accident, we may die simply through growing older and dying naturally. But in any case, the process, regardless of the cause of death, is much the same. Our physical body is constituted of solid matter, such as the flesh and bone, which is representative of the element of earth. Our body also contains fluids, blood and lymph and pus and so forth, which is the element which is representative of the element of water. Our respiration and the various kinds of energy moving in the body are representative of the motility of the element of wind. The biological warmth of our body while we are still alive, while we are animate creatures, is representative of the element of fire. And the ultimate emptiness of our mind and body, lacking any self-nature in and of themselves, is representative of the element of space. And so our mind-body complex, as it is constituted at present, is connected with and is representative of these five elements of earth, water, fire, air, and space. The process of dying, the Bardo or interval of the process of dying, involves the disintegration of this mind-body complex from grosser or coarser levels to more subtle levels. If we take the example of someone who's dying due to an illness, there may come a point where the illness is termed fatal. There are no longer any cures, any antidotes. There's nothing that can be done for the patient except to wait for them to die. And that person begins slowly but surely to die from that illness. At that point, these five elements which constitute the makeup of their mind and body begin to deteriorate. As well, the sense faculties through which that individual perceives the world, through seeing, through hearing, through smelling, through tasting, and through touching the world around them, these begin to deteriorate as well. And there is a process of dissolution whereby the coarser elements dissolve into their more subtle counterparts. The first stage of this dissolution process occurs when the element of earth dissolves into and is absorbed into the element of water, the next most subtle element. And the physical sensations of a dying person experiencing this stage are of great heaviness of body. Their physical body somehow begins to feel enormously heavy. And they find that they can't even lift their head up or move their arms and legs as they could before. They lose motor control over their limbs. And inwardly they experience a great deal of fear and suffering. And because of the dissolution of this earth element, they hear and feel what seems to them to be a great quaking of the earth. It is as though everything that is solid around them is losing its solidity. The next stage involves the dissolution of water into the next most subtle element, that of fire. And similarly, the person experiences on a physical level a dehydration of their body. They begin to lose control over their excretion. And they begin to experience a dryness of the mouth and the nasal passages and so forth as the water element dissolves. And the physical ramification of that is that the body begins to dry up, begins to lose its moisture. Inwardly, they may hear a very terrifying sound as though they were caught up in a huge flood or tempest, as though a large river were sweeping them away. And so on it goes, from grosser to or coarser to more subtle elements, each one with its attendant experiences on a physical and a mental level. As well, the person's sense faculties begin to deteriorate and fade. They begin to lose the ability to see. They can't even recognize someone as close to them as one of their parents or one of their children or their spouse. They can't recognize anyone's voice or make any sense of the sound in the world around them. And they begin to lose touch on all of these sensory levels with the world around them. And this is simply the process of this Bardo, this interval state of the process of dying, the disintegration of the mind-body complex. Now, if a person has connection through an empowerment of this kind to the teachings concerning the process of dying and the after-death state, the manifestation of the peaceful and wrathful mandalas of deities, and the nature of the dying and after-death process, then while it is difficult to maintain awareness during the dying process and during the period immediately following death, nevertheless, if one has the predisposition through connection with and study and practice of these teachings, then it is very easy for the mind to be liberated. While it is difficult to bring the mind to bear in the first place, once the mind can be brought to bear on that process, there is enormous potential for the mind to be liberated.
다 냐만바 저르저도 요레스 저르저도 때 자와 다서 저도 좀 쓰는 데 저거 요레 대가들라 냐만바 쓰는 데 저거 요레스 되네 냐만바 다서 저도 좀 쓰는데 아 되네 그지 나셔라 턴도 깔아 요 뭐아 만다 쓰 자가 요레스 집배가 요사 쓴다 통고 요레스 되나 냐만바 다서 좀 깔아 되네 다 백개서나 동사가 야래 동 대림보 타유 되네 망망에서 그 뒤로나 흥수는 호하다고 흥도가 예쁜 호하다고 저도 같은 백가는 되네 더 사승이 왔다고는 흥도하다고 또 소면은 흥도인지 받아고 또 그거는 백가는 동 나포 가용 돈좀 몇 돈을 흥수하다고 다 되다 양아를 요사 쓴 야레스.
At that point, during the final stages of the dissolution process, there are a number of very frightening, terrifying experiences that the mind of the dying individual undergoes. In general, during this lifetime, our mind is influenced by and subject to a great plethora of afflictive emotions. Buddhism speaks of some 84,000 afflictive emotions. But the root of all of these, the fundamental emotions, are those of attachment, aversion, and stupidity, or apathy of mind. And at the point that one has reached or at the point that the dying individual reaches the end of this process, all of this emotional affliction of the mind has come down to these three primary emotions of basic attachment, basic aversion, and basic stupidity, or dullness of mind. And at the point that the consciousness of the individual dissolves into the most subtle level of consciousness known as the alaya, the universal ground consciousness, there is an experience of these various frightening sounds, although of course the ears cannot hear, but inwardly the mind hears these frightening or terrifying sounds. And there is also a visual experience, which again is not experienced through the eyes, through the visual faculty, but an inward vision or an inward seeing of three abysses, three chasms into which the mind plunges. When the primary emotion of attachment dissolves and is temporarily arrested at this point, there is the experience as though the mind were plunging into a red chasm or abyss. And there is that concomitant feeling of helplessness and terror, as though the individual were actually falling headlong into that abyss. When the next primary emotion, that of anger and aversion, dissolves and is temporarily arrested, there is an experience, a light grayish abyss or expanse, bottomless pit into which the mind seems to be falling. And there is the terror which is inherent in that kind of experience. And finally, when the primary emotion of stupidity dissolves and is arrested at this stage in the dying process, there is the experience as though the mind were falling into a dark or black abyss, completely without any light or illumination, like a deep bottomless hole into which the mind is plunging headlong.
Dikan Huala, Shalame, and Hua Chagayaris, Tedishadong Topa, such a Sosong God of Yaris, Passive Dradish when I Jadon Tagamaris, so Nene, Malatope, Rata, Mapote, Yung, Hinkala Yacha, Young Yaris, Dikan Huala, Malang, Dragayaris, Dikal, Dasa Topa Jetama God of Yaris. Then come on in color, tropical, Masha, Jata, Sutro, Partella, then Nalam, Huachagayari, the Tata, Dasha Topagope color, high put up Pomatavas, Shuna, and Dasha Topasiata Maris, then that hill come on in triple partner, Masha Jado color, then not the man Dragayars, take color, then Tumula Topa Dinkone, Roger Jachigo Noto, then God Yoritine, Tremit the Jats Havaris.
At the end of this process, then, when there has been no means, no intervention possible, and finally the person dies, the process of dying comes to its final conclusion. The breakdown of the psychophysical organism completes itself when the subtle energy that is derived from the mother and father at conception, the subtle biological energy that is centered in the crown of the head and in the genitals, begins to, the duality or the polarity between these begins to break down. And first, the force which is described as the white bindu in the crown of the head, which derives from the male parent, regardless of whether you are male or female, derives from the male parent. This energy begins to move downwards towards the heart, down through the center of the body. And at that point, while the vision is no longer operating properly, there is a field of white or grayish-white illumination that the mind experiences. And with that, there is the final arrest in this lifetime of the 33 different thought patterns based upon anger and aversion. And traditionally it is said that if the mind of an individual at this particular point were presented with the sight of someone murdering their father in front of their eyes, they could feel no anger, they could feel no resentment, they could feel no aversion to that sight, because the mind is simply incapable at that point of experiencing that kind of emotion. Immediately following this, the red energy, which derives from the female parent, the mother, and which is located in the genital region, begins to rise towards the heart. And at that point, the mind is presented with a red field, a uniform red field. Again, not visually through the eyes, but a kind of inner vision. And at that point, the 40 thought patterns based upon desire and attachment are arrested. The mind becomes incapable of experiencing that emotion. Even were the mind of the individual to be presented with the most gorgeous god or goddess, there would be no thought of attachment or attraction in the mind, because it simply cannot function in that way at that point. Finally, when these two energies coalesce at the heart, there is an experience of a uniform black field, dark field. And at this point, just as the consciousness slips into unconsciousness, there is the final arrest of the 7 thought patterns based upon stupidity and dullness of mind. And so, through this threefold process, the 80 different patterns of discursive thought are arrested. The mind loses consciousness and plunges into a state resembling a faint or a swoon, falls into a state of unconsciousness.
Dharma Mamboyaris, Papa the Dharma Kundijabodavote, Puaris, Puakana, Tikala, Tata, Sashi Patul, Puak, Zumpa, Tosayana, Tikalam Pona, Zero, Lel Habo, Yoy Maris, Lel Havet, Sekarisena, Bennett, Shazi Chinkazel, Payana, Drado Jane, Treble, then come Purchushu, Nakal Padores, that was Padul listening, Tarante or Tikal, Point Palatene, Mother Piscina, Tapa de Arte de Sico, the Sipasuzo Patabatella, then Patagayares.
There are many techniques, many methods of practice which can be of use during the dying process, particularly at the end of the dying process, at the moment at which mind and body separate, when the final bond between these dissolves. And perhaps the most effective The most powerful of these is the technique known in Tibetan as poa, the transference of consciousness, whereby through a process of meditation that is practiced and with which one becomes familiar in this lifetime, one can actually facilitate the exit of the consciousness from the body in a skillful and conscious way. And so by a fairly small degree of familiarity and practice in this lifetime, a person can prepare themselves for effective release of the consciousness from the body at the moment of death. It is particularly easy to facilitate this if the person is prepared and conscious at the time, simply because the mind, at the moment that the mind-body complex finally dissolves, the bond between the two finally dissolves, the mind is like a bird that has been freed from a cage and is ready to take off. If you've ever watched a bird that is just poised, ready to fly, you know that the slightest movement, the slightest thing that startles it, sets it off into the air, because it's in a state of total readiness. And in the same way, the mind at that point is in a state of total readiness to be transferred, to be moved to a higher level of consciousness. Ideally, at this point, the mind, through skillful application of the poa technique, the transference of consciousness, can attain to a blissful and pure state of experience, a pure realm, rather than having to go through the otherwise inevitable process of rebirth in samsara.
Tene that deka tela tene chini padamala tene the jaro kala tene rasato shaja chimbo zopa chimbo tene nyala yapayana tene de cheka padok dunga jito te pena la chimbo jikala temo tane deyana tene la tinone matrato posato runalas pako ragena tunga yares 대답을 대처와 등하지 처와 지적을 처와 거에 받다지 통화자네 등하기네 용거야 말이지 만요와도 가르치는 나들이 가서도 사도라서 바감에 또 텔레쇼레스 다 제메도 나트메 저희 카텔라 되네 페나 실라 니마 라소나 넘바라소나 되네 노라 바티 세버지 바잖아 용살 속에 저거를 베티노지가 들 산타 만타세 자타스 로아테 매네 리파론사도 지가와 들 다타가서 사면에 가서 라바 노지 사리토스 순디지 바티몬 로트가 야레스 자치를 나타가 야레스 다자자 드네 지리 바도 두가라 트르타가 야레스.
The next stage of the process brings us to the interval, the Bardo or interval state of dharmata, of the fundamental nature of reality. The normal way in which this is usually experienced by an unenlightened being is as a state of unconsciousness. That is to say, the mind finally slips into a state of total darkness, total unconsciousness. If a practitioner has been exposed to and has developed some familiarity with the yoga of luminous clarity of mind, or of the Mahamudra teachings, or the great perfection teachings of the Nyingma school, at this point, the person will experience all of the appearances, all of the perceptions of the process of dying, but without the attendant suffering that an unprepared individual might. It will be rather like sitting in a car or a bus and taking a trip and watching the scenery go by. That is to say, you take note of it as it goes by, but you don't react to it in any emotional way necessarily. It simply passes in front of your eyes and is noted as so doing. And in the same way, a person who has this stability of practice and this insight into the nature of mind will go through the stages of dying, but will not experience the same kind of emotional quality of suffering and pain that an unprepared individual would. And furthermore, at the moment of death, where there is normally this slipping of the mind into unconsciousness, there dawns rather a state of illumination for such a prepared individual, due to their realization of the luminous clarity of mind, due to their experience of Mahamudra or Mahāti. They experience rather what is similar to the turning on of a light when the sun sets. That is to say, when one kind of illumination disappears, you replace it with another kind of illumination, and there is no darkness that ensues. Because as soon as one kind of illumination fades from view, there is another to replace it. And the way in which this takes place is simply that due to the power of their practice, due to the influence of their meditative insight, the inherent luminous clarity of intrinsic awareness dawns at the moment of death. The moment at which the mind would normally plunge into unconsciousness triggers this experience of the inherent luminous clarity. Rinpoche says, as I have described before, the nature of mind is emptiness, is luminous clarity, and is an unimpeded and dynamic manifestation of this emptiness and luminous clarity. And so it is possible for the Bardo, the interval state of dharmata, of the fundamental nature of reality, to be experienced not as a state of unconsciousness, but as the dawning of this new kind of illumination, the inherent luminous clarity of mind. Now, this experience of resting one pointedly in the inherent luminous clarity of mind can last for a period of 3 to 7 days, depending on the given individual concerned. But it culminates in the attainment of awakened Buddhahood. In the Nyingma tradition, the ancient tradition of the Great Perfection teachings, or Mahā'ati teachings, there is often a quote which is referred to in the teachings that through this system, if you meditate in the morning, you attain enlightenment in the morning. If you meditate in the evening, you attain enlightenment in the evening. You even attain enlightenment without meditating. The point is that there's this instantaneous realization. In the Sarma, or new schools of Tibetan Buddhism, through dealing with the Mahamudra approach, there's a similar quote from one of the root texts which states that in a single instant you are completely awakened as a Buddha. In a single instant you understand the difference, that is to say, the difference between samsara and nirvana. In either case, regardless of how we choose to describe it, there is the experience of awakened Buddhahood. If a given individual is not able to achieve this release during the Bardo, during the interval of dharmata, the fundamental state of reality, fundamental nature of reality, but instead experiences this period of unconsciousness, at a certain point, just before the Bardo of becoming, the process of rebirth begins, there is an interval, a brief interval, in which there are the glimmerings of consciousness and discursive awareness arising in the mind again. And the way that this particular process of returning consciousness is experienced by the mind is in terms of the configurations of these mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities, of the 58 wrathful and 42 peaceful deities of the Bardo, or intermediate state. There is a spontaneous arising of these forms, these divine forms, in these symmetrical configurations, as well as the experience of rays and points of light, which again, there is no normal vision involved, but an inner vision in which the mind experiences these as though they were external projections. through the process of empowerment into these mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities and the practice based upon this empowerment, a person in this lifetime can gain the kind of faith and confidence in this experience and awareness of the nature of this experience that when their mind finally is presented with it in the Bardo, in the after-death state, rather than experiencing fear and terror at these seeming apparitions, the individual's mind understands or recognizes the divine nature of that experience and simply rests naturally in the inseparability of the mind experiencing the mandalas and the mandalas as projections of the mind. And so this is another opportunity at which it could be particularly easy for the mind to become liberated from the cycle of existence. If on the basis of these projections manifesting as which are manifestations of the intrinsic awareness of the mind, the dynamic and intrinsic awareness of the mind, on the basis of those projections, through recognition, the mind can be released. And so here's another opportunity where these kinds of teachings can prove effective.
당신 촬영 그야레스 데칼라 라라 라이만 마셔봐도 라로세만 마시나 저트가 야레데 그만다고 초이까다고 저렇게 찌찌고 저트 가본다고 야레 가르치는 리파트는 드라마스 바리다 또마도 소와니 뭐 저트 그래 또저 간조하레데 이나요 저트가 야레스.
The first instant of this experience is that of the mandala of 58 wrathful deities. And if the mind of the deceased individual can recognize these deities for what they are, recognize them as nothing more or less than the projections of mind itself, then it is possible for the mind to become liberated in that very instant because of the very dynamic quality of these wrathful deities as the expression of intrinsic awareness. In the very next instant, if the mind does not become liberated, there is the arising of the mandala of the 42 peaceful deities. And again, if the individual can recognize these as the inherently divine projections of his or her own mind, then as before, there can be release. It will be slightly less instantaneous. It won't be as direct or as immediate as in the case of the wrathful deities. Because the peaceful deities are manifestations rather of the emptiness and luminous clarity of mind rather than its dynamic and intelligent awareness. And so there is a subtle difference to be noted here. It is not that it is any less effective in the long run, but that there will be a slight difference in the immediacy. It is far more immediate when the realization takes place during the dawning of the wrathful mandala than during the dawning of the peaceful mandala. But again, the difference is only slight and does not constitute a fundamental difference in terms of the eventual result.
Bardo, 제가 봐도도 친히 봐도 저 특별히 나서 가르쳐서는 되는 알아서 새 나서 되라 되는 새 코로 나서 있는데 되는 다시까지 다시 뭐 달까지 여셔서 그러스 달 손제가 되는 전레블라서 받쳐마 손제가 여태 거에 받을까지 다시 뭐 나가요 알아서 그지 여셔스 되는 그지 여셔때 말을 bedrne 롱롱 셰마도 토마도 발때네 그지 나셔서 그러스 그지 나셔라 나셔 소제라서 받주네 되는 그지 여셔도 되네 손제 롱산 손제이 맞다 가마시 받을 때네 되는 트러스 말스 트바들 때는 라지 온게 가르스 다다 말이 터나요 되는 나서 셔트가 말스 셔라 가르스 린달라 요아 되는 다다 품보가 나시 소제 예를 제라서 봐 되는 소마 야레스 대통제 마시타나 대단체 시릴 하수고 론지 임바레스 대가르서나 이게 마시네 예시이나 예시 카로라 예시 코로라 시릴 하수 터치 론지 예시 제명원에 나요아레스 되네 다다가로서 민지 첨부 단지 첨부 셈바 첨부 인자 트로트 커버요아레스 이나 다다랑 거나 되네 체지 바도 가라 되네 마미지 레도 잔도요아레스 대가라 되네 와시나 되네 조저 레하고 까보면 트로트요아레 대치니 바다고 당 되네 조더버레스 다 대지라 되네 토마토나 스파파도 차가야레스.
In general, the fact that the mind of a given individual can achieve freedom or release during these interval states of the dying process and the experience immediately following death, the Bardo of Dharmata, Bardo of the fundamental nature of reality, the fact that this is possible is due to the fact that the very nature of our minds, the way our mind actually is in and of itself, which is sometimes described as the Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, which is sometimes described as the primordial awareness, which is the basis of all experience, that within that fundamental nature of mind, all of the positive qualities of enlightenment, all of the causes and the results to which they lead in the spiritual path, all of these are complete, are inherent as latent potentials. It is simply the case that this inherent primordial awareness, which is the basis of all enlightened experience, is somehow obscured or distorted. There is a lack of a direct appreciation on our parts of that Buddha nature. And because our mind cannot experience directly its own true nature, there is rather a distortion of this primordial awareness into a discursive consciousness, which is the basis of all unenlightened experience. And from this fundamental state, arising from a lack of direct and inherent awareness, there emerge various avenues of discursive consciousness, which are sometimes referred to collectively as the 8 avenues of discursive consciousness. And these give rise to the whole spectrum of confused appearances which constitute samsara, the cycle of conditioned existence. Even though we have attained a particularly fortunate state of rebirth as human beings within that cycle, we are nevertheless incapable of directly recognizing that nature of mind, except as an intellectual concept. It remains a latent potential. But the very way in which our psychophysical organism is constituted, even within samsara, has a direct analogy to the enlightened state of being. Our body is composed of the 5 elements. Our psychophysical makeup is sometimes described in Buddhism from the point of view of the 5 skandhas, or aggregates. We speak of these 8 avenues of discursive consciousness and their corresponding objects. If we are able to perceive directly, not intellectualize, but to perceive directly and recognize the true nature of all of these different facets of our experience, we experience them as the kinds of energies and the kinds of principles represented by the peaceful and wrathful deities in these mandalas. We might say that the peaceful and wrathful deities, the mandalas of peaceful and wrathful deities, reside inherently within this fundamental stratum of being, which is primordial awareness. Now, during our waking state, in this lifetime, we view the world around us with a great deal of fixation upon its solidity and reality, with a great deal of, we focus upon ourselves, our perceived egos, or selves, investing them with a great deal of solidity and reality. And we cling to these perceptions as though they were some kind of ultimate truth. But during the process in which the mind is inevitably divorced from the physical body, this physical body which is a product of previous karma, At that point, it is particularly easy for this realization to take place, for the fiction of conventional reality to be seen through, and for the individual to perceive the inherently pure nature of the experience and the inherently pure nature of all the different facets of their ordinary experience. And so all of the impure elements of our experience are directly analogous to these different aspects of pure or enlightened awareness as represented by the peaceful and wrathful deities in these mandalas. However, it may be the case that the individual again misses this opportunity, and the next Bardo state, the next interval through which the mind will pass, is that of the so-called Sipe Bardo, the Bardo of becoming, which is the process of rebirth.
Sipa Bardo reset about the teacher shackles, then concept about the shaka, the nemato, Manchava Yaris, Taka pen of the teacher shackable, the cheat about Sinchela, then Pen America Magina, American Nuado, Los Angeles Nuado, Sosago No, Chisel Pama Poja Las of Noa, there's a Kaka and Chagayari, that's all of then. Then higher court Jalen Dragaris, then Dinchi Panchene Pasitene, Tatin Hoa the Zoots already, then a Kaya Chagmaris, America Chagmari, Sosaka Yeri Chagmari, Cheso Chagmari, Pama Punjalas, Bangocha Yamari, then Katu, Sapalunga Chianoji, Hoa, Koishana, Tagaro in Bades, so then Temata Yan Maris. Tata Gayla Chichamayakaso, Super Padilla, Guy, or Troy, or Shipping, or Momo Chagaris, Tata Dipazan Kaina, Tikatilla, Jipit, or Dumachin, or then Maldipa Mamo and Huachene, Tanda, then it's a papa the year into Cadena, then Pada Tukurum Bazootsari, Pada Yer Mazootsari, then Harium. Duari to Karasina, Sene Padone Zutetele, or Pada to Kone Dragaris.
Traditionally, this final period of Bardo or interval state, that of becoming, the process of moving towards rebirth in samsara, is held to be 49 days. But this is an approximate figure. It may last as long as 41 days. It may last as short a time as a week or several weeks. But generally speaking, the period of 49 days has been traditionally presented as at least by and large, the maximum time that the mind will spend between, in a disembodied state, between the death in a previous lifetime and the conception or birth into a future lifetime. Now, during this period of time, the mind experiences many different hallucinations and projections. During the earlier part of this interval, these are largely based upon the state of existence immediately preceding the previous lifetime in which the person or being has just died. So if you were an American living in Los Angeles, you would start to have perceptions of being in Los Angeles or being in America, perhaps seeing your family again, or friends, or environments that you were familiar with in this lifetime. All kinds of experiences would arise in your mind as a direct projection of this emotional triad of attachment, aversion, and stupidity arising again in your mind. There would be no external reality to these perceptions. It would be just as though you were recalling experiences from the former lifetime. But towards the latter half of this process, even the appearances of the previous lifetime finish. At that point, the mind is no longer conscious of America or Los Angeles or the parents in the previous lifetime or anything that was familiar in the lifetime before. Any trace or vestige of that experience has been lost. And instead, the mind is rather like a bird's feather being blown around in the wind, completely at random. And the kinds of experiences that come up in the mind are completely random and chaotic. And so there is a complete disorder, a complete lack of coherence to the perceptions and appearances that arise in the mind at this point. If the individual is one who has accumulated a great deal of positive karma through virtuous activity in previous lifetime, these appearances will be largely of a joyful or pleasant or happy nature. If the person, on the other hand, has committed a great deal of harmful action in the previous lifetime, the negative karmic patterns give rise to many terrifying and painful and unfortunate experiences. But nevertheless, regardless of the nature of the experience, or rather of the content of the experience, the process is such that after a given amount of time, that may be longer or shorter, depending on the given individual, at a certain point the process comes to an end and the mind is propelled by karmic forces beyond its control into another state of rebirth, as a human being or as a being in one of the other of the 6 realms of samsara. And so again, we begin this process all over again, of the mind circling through these different states of Bardo, of intermediate state.
Tata padik nasu tsuma chena sonje ksemi chichi pumo jare jitola sopa padik nasu lipa chichi to shara kachi mujiris asa la pado tene tukula susu su dekenda yina tene pado tela pembe tap pado jato tula sopa pembe tap zoda bote pena sama yina tene toni to nije sacha chime yesote la nara chiru to naga chiru la supane rumakis tene jele mana tumma jele mana wa pado vasa zone pado la pembe dona tache rumakis yunga yares tene soha nime unde tona yo teno jila je toni ijele teng la se zoni le teng la pado tene dara je zopachevo chesele te la tegal te chesela sisne te te dama mazazane tomo ngorodu te ipa de chosu to ja jiba chini ronde jwate sisne te mango zozo de jela te lam tegal jesu te chini ngasu ya kompe ripatsabe chini sepe thonga jere tene tene padawelasa tsuma rumajis pembetap tene tukuna dekheto nyasa lakina tene kotaga yores tene tatagaroso dekaya marite savena bojire nina savena bojo konayo tene sheraga kechamoto panto chemuri tene soni noni pajela tene onde kandere onsekete kanechware onga nasa kandere del panto kane yore la sezu sakete kane padal pamade kane yore remajis tene cheta yongre jara kechimbares.
In general, then, this concept of Bardo, or intermediate state, is so all-encompassing that one could really regard all of the 84,000 collections of the Buddha's teachings as being subsumed under this concept of Bardo. It is that crucial or that important. In particular, people who have taken part in the 3 or 3-month retreat program, or who intend to do so in the future, will be interested to know that this retreat is set up along the lines of presenting in a developmental way to the individual the methods by which one comes to appreciate and begin to work with the 4 or 6 states of Bardo, the different interval states that arise in one's life. In the Sarma, or new traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, the ground of the path is held to be the simultaneous union of emptiness and compassion as the inherent nature of being. And the path that is followed employs such techniques as the yogas, the 6 yogas of Naropa and the 6 yogas of Niguma, which are very powerful and effective means for learning to transform these different intermediate states. They are concerned directly with the luminous clarity yoga of the state of deep sleep and the dream yoga of the dream state. The practice of Bardo, which is particularly concerned with transformation of the after-death experience and the skillful use of that experience in spiritual development. And all of these are presented in a progressive and developmental way during the period of 3 years and 3 months in this retreat. In the Nyingmapa school, the ancient school of Tibetan Buddhism, again, the ground is recognized as the same union of emptiness and compassion. And the 2 stages of development and completion of tantric practice form the path in this system as well. The particular tenets of the Nyingmapa school involve what is called trekje on the one hand, which means something like cutting through or cutting through solidity, and tugal, or leaping beyond the peak, going beyond the pinnacle. And the Nyingmapa path is sometimes described as the ground of trekje, the ground in which the person comes to recognize, through cutting through the solid misconceptions about the nature of reality, comes to recognize the true nature of reality for what it is, and to appreciate the natural freedom of mind within the true nature of that reality. The person then follows the path of tugal, or passing beyond the pinnacle, leaping beyond the pinnacle, in which there is a fourfold progression of experience. First, the individual technically, these are termed the actualization of dharmata, of the true nature of reality, where this is brought into actual living experience. The second level of Dzogchen, or Great Perfection experience, is termed the enrichment of one's meditation experience. The third is known as the stage at which intrinsic awareness is brought to its fullest measure. And there is finally what is termed the exhaustion of dharmata, where one comes to the very limit of the nature of reality and passes beyond to the ultimate experience. And again, in this kind of system, one is dealing very directly with this concept of Bardo, these different intervals in our experience, and how to work within those intervals in the most skillful way. Obviously, this kind of approach, even as it is presented in a 3-year and 3-month retreat program, takes a great deal of time which we don't have this evening. All we can do at this point in a short period of time is plant seeds, but that doesn't mean those seeds are wasted. That doesn't mean to say that because it's a short treatment that it's somehow superficial or not meaningful. If a person appreciates what seed has been planted, then the fruit can nevertheless grow from that seed. Over the next few days, there will be some explanation of the nature of the empowerment, of what one is to be focusing upon, meditating upon during the empowerment, of the nature of empowerment in general, what the benefits of empowerment are in general, and this particular empowerment in particular, and how, in a general way, how the stages of development and completion are applied in an individual's practice. And so by paying attention to these seeds as they are planted and by appreciating their significance, a person's understanding comes to grow and grow. Rinpoche says, now, in general, to look at me, you might think, well, here's an old man who isn't up to very much. He doesn't have a lot of energy, and really you can't expect him to carry on for too long. But Rinpoche says, if it's a benefit to anyone, I'll keep talking. I'll talk as long as you want me to. As long as there's benefit for you folks out there, I'll keep talking. We do, however, have to take time into account, and we are running late. Rinpoche said, I had hoped to offer to bestow the vow of refuge this evening for those people who may be wishing to take part in this Vajrayana empowerment tomorrow and have not yet received the formal transmission of refuge. Obviously, it's too late for that tonight. What we will do is make time in the program tomorrow afternoon before the actual empowerment, the preparation for the empowerment begins. So in the early afternoon tomorrow, for those people who wish to receive the vow of refuge, who have not formally done so, you should understand that it is a prerequisite for the empowerment, and you should come tomorrow afternoon, and before the actual empowerment starts in the afternoon, there will be the vow of refuge. To conclude for this evening then, let us join together in dedicating the roots of virtue, as we would say in the Buddhist tradition, the fundamental virtue that has been established through the explanation and the listening to the explanation of this concept of Bardo, dedicating this virtue so that all sentient beings may eventually be freed from the ocean of suffering, which is samsara, and that they may attain the state, the precious state of awakened enlightenment, which is Buddhahood. So let us join together in a spirit of dedication and aspiration to conclude the gathering.
Chitra chamba dan kundu sambo te ante jente te da kunje jesu dala kewa dada tanchera do jewa kondo yanda lama dan rame chiche pala longche che sado longje yonten razone torje chonge kopone to yo Siddha Kordo Jena Tsele Sale Jenu Je Pache Jene Trashi Soma Chi Jenu Je Trashi Yo Dasara Sato Salaya